as somebody who's studied it again and again, back to front, is it fact? Is anything in there historical fact?
Very little, probably. I think one important thing to bear in mind is that ancient writers had a very different understanding of what fact or fiction was from us today. It wasn't written to be a factual account of the past. I don't think that's the way in which these biblical writers understood the past. But as a historian of the Bible, I think there's very little that's factual.
King David?
No.
Moses?
No.
Somebody said Jesus behind me. I don't think they were taking the Lord's name in vain.
No, Jesus, most scholars would agree that he existed, yeah.
So a hodgepodge of writings by different writers, scribes at different times with different agendas.
Absolutely, and a hodgepodge is like not doing it a great service. I mean, it's a very sophisticated collection of ancient literature. I mean, it's fantastic stuff. It really is. Lots of different genres, lots of different sorts of traditions that are being adopted and adapted and then readapted by successive writers. These were very creative people that were producing these texts. It's brilliant stuff.
But the sum of it, was it put together somewhat arbitrarily? That's the point I mean by hodgepodge over the years, for a purpose. I mean, the books that are there, why those books? Why not other books?
Very few of the biblical books were written to be included in a Bible. Yeah. That's quite a late idea, late from my perspective as a historian. Yeah, so they weren't necessarily written to be included in a Bible. These are religious writings. Some of them got into the Bible, some of them didn't, as we know. The choices that were made as to what should be contained in this collection, I mean, it's very hard to say. Some things are obviously more appropriate, the collectors felt, than others.
Bishop Michael.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Francesca that there are many different genres in the Bible. There's obviously poetry in the Bible, there are proverbs, but there's also history. I mean, take, for instance, the sudden appearance in archaeological evidence of the rather crude dwellings of the Israelites superimposed on the rather sophisticated dwellings of the Canaanites. The sudden disappearance of the cults that Francesca is so interested in of Asherah and Baal. Why did these things happen? Because something historical had happened. Another people had come into the land and supplanted those who had already been there. Well, that's historical.
But archaeologically, it's very difficult to tell a Canaanite from an Israelite.
Well, archaeologically, I'm just pointing out the differences. The crude housing that the Israelites, as former nomadic people, had used. The fact that these cultic shrines suddenly stopped being built. I mean, something was happening, and we have to give an account of what was happening.
But if most of it didn't happen, why should we pay
but it did
most
happen, you see.
Well, Noah's Ark?
Well, I'm talking about what happened in Canaan. I'm not saying that everything in the Bible is historical, because clearly it isn't. I mean, there's saga, there's poetry, there are proverbs, there is wisdom, but there is also material that is historical. I mean, the writing prophets, for instance, bear witness to contemporary events that were happening all around them. Now, you may have a different interpretation of those events. Their enemies at that time certainly did, and quite a lot of what we know about Israel, actually we know from their enemies. What the conquering kings and those passing through the armies, what they tell us. Their accounts may be different, but they're witnessing to the same sorts of peoples and events that were going on. I think this kind of radical skepticism is unwarranted.
Radical skepticism.
Yeah, I get that quite a lot.
I bet you do, yeah.
I think...
You deserve to get it, yes.
But I think it's important to point out that what you might perceive as radical skepticism actually is all about debates that we've been having in academia for a long time. I'm not...
Which academia? Albright, John Bright, G.E. Wright?
Well,
which academia are we talking? Kathleen Kenyon?
A long time.
Well, that doesn't make that work irrelevant. I mean, being dead doesn't make academics irrelevant.
Well, it does make it outdated in terms of the ways in which academia engages with other branches and other disciplines which help us to understand.
This is just sensationalism. I mean, most mainstream archaeology would accept that there is a historical basis to what there is of history in the Bible. As I say, not everything in the Bible is history.
I didn't say there was no history.
Well, you said hardly any facts.
I said hardly any facts, exactly. I think the point remains is that, of course, there are some things in the Bible that broadly happened.
I'm
the exile of the people to Babylon. But
how generous.
But and equally, just as you said, there's a lot that isn't fact.
But even you say, Bishop Michael...
In fact, the Psalms are about somebody's emotional and religious stage. The Proverbs are about wisdom. I mean, there are different sorts of the Song of Solomon
how do you
that Professor
know whether
Dawkins
to read
likes.
Something as history or something as not history in the Bible?
Well, the Book of Kings or the Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah, I mean, the writing prophets that I've mentioned, I mean, there are historical things in them that need to be investigated and interpreted.
Well, the book of Isaiah has material that stretches over several centuries,
of course it does.
And it only has the name of one prophet.
Yes, but that's a historical point.
Can I just move it on from you two? Fascinating as it is to hear this historical. Rabbi Laura, no Moses, no David, they don't exist. This undermines Judaism.
Well, it doesn't undermine anything as I'm listening to you. I have a completely different take on what fact is and what my approach is to the Bible. That when I look at the Bible, I'm not a archaeologist or historian in that way. I'm looking at it as a teacher, as a theologian, and for me it has truth. It has truth that changes my life. Yeah. It has truth that I think affects other people's lives. It has things that I love. It has things that I can't stand, and I'm entering that debate. So the fact of what was, whether there was Babylonian, whether there was David or Moses, there's lots of information that says, or scholars who say there was Moses and why. It might have been with a different and slightly different name. But I'm not entering that phrase.
So it doesn't need to be historically true because there is truth in it. There's a greater truth.
A completely different kind of truth.
Yeah. So Richard, I mean, similarly, there are great truths in the Greek fables, aren't there, of mythology. It doesn't need to be true for us to derive truth from it.
The world is full of origin myths and creation myths and myths of all kinds, and many of them are very beautiful. But what worries me about the Bible is that it has acquired, in our civilization, an enormous privileged position. I mean, everybody knows something about the Greek myths and the Valhalla myths and so on, and some other myths as well. And they are interesting, and they're treated as interesting myths. But the Bible myths are given a special privileged treatment. I mean, they're regarded as somehow set off on one side, away from all these other myths. No doubt you'll find truths in the other myths. You'll find some truths of that kind in Australian Aboriginal myths.
Yes, although I'm looking for God.
Well, which God? I mean, why not Jupiter? Why not Zeus? Why not Thor?
Yes, I think that...
Mr. Michael, allow me to stay over here just to hear Richard out. Yeah, go on.
Well, that's about it, really. I mean, I object to the way...
I hope there's more to come from you.
I was simply objecting to the way the Judeo-Christian myth has permeated our society to such an enormous extent, as though somehow it has special truths which are not to be found in other myths. And I don't think there's much truth to be found in any myths, as a matter of fact, but certainly there's no reason why the Judeo-Christian myth should be given this privileged status. And as for it not being literally true, of course, sophisticated theologians and historians don't think it's literally true, but 40%, 45% of the American people believe literally in Adam and Eve, believe literally that the world is only 6,000 years old. I mean, that's a shocking figure, and you can't duck out of it by saying, oh, sophisticated theologians don't believe it. Unfortunately, what sophisticated theologians believe isn't really relevant to what the majority of Christians do believe.
Chris, I think, Richard, cue Chris from the Evangelical Alliance, if I may, because you believe it's all true, don't you?
I do, yeah.
So you believe that Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark, you believe, to just take something, Genesis 19:5, 2 angels came to Lot's house in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, he was the only righteous man in the village, and the locals wanted to know the angels. They wanted to homosexually rape the angels. So Lot offered his virgin daughters instead as an appeasement. Sodom and Gomorrah was demolished after that, and his wife turned into a block of salt when she looked back. You believe that happened?
I take my cues from Jesus, who we've already agreed is historically
did that
accurate.
happen?
I believe
I
that
didn't.
Jesus believed the Old Testament to be historically accurate.
Do you believe that that happened?
I believe it happened because Jesus did.